Politicians who told Canadians to stay home during the Christmas break were found traveling all over the place. Nice tropical sandy locations like Mexico, Hawaii, and the very posh and exclusive St. Bart's in the Caribbean. Now, some of those politicians even lost their jobs as a result. To talk more about this in detail is Canadian political reporter Brian Lilley, joining me once again from Toronto. Brian, many Canadians are not happy with these politicians.
No, I haven't quite seen anger like this. I knew when the story about Rod Phillips, who was the first, he's now Ontario's former finance minister, I knew the story was going to drop and I knew it was going to create anger. But even I was surprised at how much anger. And then it moved on from him to, well, there were United Conservative Party members in Alberta, members of the government, including the Minister Allard, who lost her job over this as Minister of Municipal Affairs and Emergency Preparedness, who was going to disappear to Hawaii for 3 weeks. And, different people in governments in Saskatchewan, at the federal level, in opposition parties, people stripped of their parliamentary committee duties, their critic duties. There was a lot of anger over this because some of them, Conservative Senator Don Plett, who's one of the latest to be found out, he was vacationing down in Mexico, had recorded a video in front of a Christmas tree telling us all to stay home. And then he jetted off to Mexico, where he was seen, according to reports, talking loudly about government business on the phone and bragging about being a big shot politician in Canada. And that was poolside. I mean, this is insanity. 3 and 4 week vacations for politicians, while the rest of us are told to stay home. So no wonder Canadians are outraged. And no, it's turned into a bit of a witch hunt. I'll be the first to admit that. But I also understand the fury and the rage.
Brian, lots of talk about travel even within our borders here in Canada. New Brunswick Premier Blaine Higgs says he doesn't want to change anything until at least 70% of his province is vaccinated, and the tourism industry is getting to be quite concerned.
And no wonder. Tourism is one of the industries that's been hardest hit by the pandemic and the rolling lockdowns and restrictions that every part of the country has instituted at one part or another. And maybe you or your viewers don't have a particular connection to New Brunswick, but how many of us hail from a different part of the country and want to go home? If this takes off, if premiers say, no, you can't come in even from outside without a 2-week quarantine, then tourism within Canada will collapse. And, I would argue that it's unconstitutional to do this, but the Atlantic bubble did this during the summer. They did this up until late fall. They were saying, you cannot, even as a Canadian, you cannot drive in here without a 2-week quarantine. Peter MacKay, after losing the Conservative leadership, packed up his family and moved back to central Nova Scotia to his family homestead. They had to quarantine for 2 weeks when he got there. Can you imagine having to do that? You want to go back home to see your family in another part of the country and you've got a quarantine? That's not going to fly very well. Governments across the country, though, are concerned about tourism. I can tell you here in Ontario, the Ford government is looking at bringing in a 20% staycation tax credit to boost the tourism industry next summer. Now, you have to do the vacation inside Ontario to get an Ontario tax credit. But, unemployment in this industry, we're talking hotels, restaurants, tourism sites, it fell by more than 50% during the pandemic. When you've got unemployment rates of 50% in any one industry that employs millions of people across the country, that's a bad thing. So worrisome comments from Premier Higgs. Some hopeful thoughts from Ontario. Let's see where this plays out.
Be a tourist in your own town. I kind of like that idea. I'll get on the phone with Premier Jason Kenney, see what he has to say about that. Brian, it seems that politicians aren't the only one who've been caught traveling overseas. A recent report says there were a bunch of Canadian partiers living it up in Playa del Carmen, Mexico.
Yeah, this was from a Montreal newspaper. They went down and what they found was they said, we hear there's a bunch of Quebecers down there. Go down and see. And what they found were a bunch of people from Montreal, the South Shore, Quebec City, all partying it up in Mexico, not following any social distancing, no public health guidelines like we would have here. And even the local Mexican public health guidelines were mostly ignored, according to the report. Now, you can't just say, well, that's Quebecers. When you look at the flights that come in from outside of the country with COVID cases on it, I've been counting this up for a few weeks, Al. Cancun to Calgary, one of the top spots for bringing COVID into Canada. So there's an awful lot of Albertans going down to Mexico as well. And thankfully, we might see some changes in how that plays out, because Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has now announced that you can't go south for a vacation, then come back in quarantine, and while you're in quarantine, collect the workers' sickness benefits. The federal government set up this sickness benefit for people who had to quarantine because they may have been exposed, they can't go into their workplace because of COVID, and they don't have sick days. It's meant for workers. As Prime Minister Trudeau said when he announced this on Tuesday, this is not so to pay you for your 2 weeks at home after your week-long vacation down south getting a suntan. Well, good for him on that. I'm glad he's doing it, and it's the right move for sure.
I don't know about you, but my week-long Christmas vacation consisted of me going from the living room to the kitchen and then right back to the living room again, with those little snackies.
But some World Juniors in there.
That's right, yeah, World Juniors. Now, there's some new criticisms of the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy, Brian, having gone to companies that didn't need it, including those that paid big bucks, big bonuses to their executives.
Yeah, there's been a couple of different reports on this, some in the financial press, some in the political press. One looked at 60 different companies and that are listed on stock exchanges like the TSX, and found that many of them were paying bonuses to their executives or dividends. We're talking about $5 billion worth of bonuses and dividends paid out, but these same companies took more than $1 billion in the wage subsidy. Then there's companies like Linamar, which is a stalwart of the auto parts industry, the independent auto parts industry that supplies the Toyotas and the Hondas and the GMs and the Ford plants here in southern Ontario and throughout Michigan. This is a company that increased its dividend from 6 cents a share to 12 cents a share while taking the wage subsidy. This is not what this was designed for. And, unfortunately, I just praised the Prime Minister for saying we're going to take away this benefit for people that are going south for a vacation. That's the good part. The bad part is this wage subsidy, this is something the NDP, the Conservatives, they pointed out in the beginning. No, you've got to tie it to jobs. They didn't listen on so many fronts, on so many issues. They did not listen to the opposition on how to improve the wage subsidy over many months, and they didn't tie it to jobs. And the companies say, oh no, we're using this money for jobs. Well, yeah, you're using that money for jobs because you're saving a bunch of money elsewhere and paying it out in dividends. You shouldn't be paying dividends or big bonuses when you are doing this. I'll tell you this much. My employer, which is ultimately Post Media, they're the owners of the Toronto Sun, our executives did not take bonuses. In fact, they took wage cuts while taking the wage subsidy for regular working Joes like me. They're also not paying dividends. So that's the way it should be. That should have been a condition of getting this. The government didn't put it in there, even though they were warned.
Now, Brian, the orders in some places not to travel have turned into stay-at-home curfew in Quebec. Now, is this the start of harsher lockdown measures being spread across the country?
Well, this is the call for harsher lockdown measures that we're hearing in many places. And so now Quebec's moving towards a curfew. Not the first place to do this. In parts of France, they're looking at curfews that run from 6 p.m. till 8 p.m. That's when they start, depending on where you live in different hot zones. And they go until 6 or 7 the next morning. Again, it depends. In parts of South Africa, I believe the curfew's at 9 o'clock. We're going to start seeing conversations about this. I'm not a fan of the idea. I think it, more than any of the other, and we've had some very measures that are very much against the Charter of Rights and Civil Liberties. I think this would be among the worst. And thankfully, Premier Doug Ford here in Ontario has said no in the past, but just earlier this week said, well, everything's on the table. We'll see where the numbers go. Our case numbers are going up in many parts of the country, but thankfully the hospitalizations and the ICU cases, while rising, are not rising at the same rate as cases. When you compare, say, the first wave in the spring to this wave now, the rise in cases is not matched by the rise in hospitalizations, ICUs, and best of all, not matched in terms of deaths in some places. Others, like British Columbia, it's been a different story.
I could just see that, the government saying, go to your room, it's time for bed, 9 o'clock, go home. It's time, like acting like your parent here. It's unbelievable. Brian, a group calling itself Global Canada has called for a national 4 to 6 week lockdown. I talked to a lot of business owners. They're not happy about this. Who is this group exactly, and why are they proposing this?
Global Canada is a think tank of sorts that's been around since 2014. Some viewers are going to be very upset at the mere mention of this. They did get a lot of their early funding from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And so for people that are convinced that Bill Gates is behind the entire plandemic and is just out to market vaccines, this is proof of yet more nefarious deeds. I haven't found evidence of a lot of Gates funding in the years since 2014-15. I did talk to Robert Greenhill, the man behind this report, calling for a Canadian Shield approach to COVID-19. He has some good ideas. He has some bad ideas. I'm not a fan of just one more lockdown of 4 to 6 weeks. And I'll tell you why. They say a hard lockdown of 4 to 6 weeks and then gradually releasing restrictions on an incremental basis until you get to 1 case per million of population per day. So for Alberta, you would have to have no more than 5 cases a day before full measures, lockdown measures were released. In Ontario, it would be 15 or fewer. We haven't been at that level since the beginning of this, and I don't see us going back to that. Think of the flu. You could find 15 cases of the flu if you were looking and testing widely in the middle of June. When the flu is at its low, at its ebb. That's the way it's going to be with COVID-19 for a long time to come, even with vaccines. So I don't like that idea. What I do like is that they're calling for stricter measures on the border to try and control the influx of new cases from there. Even vaccinating truckers that have to go back and forth, making them a priority group. I think that's a good idea. But this lockdown idea, no.
A point of contention for many during the lockdowns are the church service restrictions, Brian. In Alberta, we're at 15% capacity. The Justice Centre for Constitutional Freedoms, led by John Carpy in Calgary, is representing some Ontario churches in their fight to worship. What's the latest?
Many of these churches are throughout southwestern Ontario. If you follow religion and politics, and they often intertwine, that stretch along the 401, going from about Kitchener-Waterloo out past London, Ontario, is known as one of Ontario's mini Bible belts. And a lot of the pastors out there said, no, we want to continue having worship services. Some wanted in person, some wanted drive-in. There have been fights back and forth. Different churches have responded differently. Some, there's evangelicals up the street from me, evangelical churches that went immediately to online services. The Catholic Church across the street from me, they canceled Mass in person. They do it online, but they allow you to go in for up to 10 people, 20 minutes at a time for silent prayer. Some churches are willing to work with government. Some say it's too much of an infringement. The Justice Centre for Constitutional Freedoms is going to fight for these groups. So far, it hasn't been tested beyond 1 case of a Toronto church who tried to get an exemption just for them. This will be a different sort of constitutional challenge.
And when I talked to some of the lawyers at the Justice Centre for Constitutional Freedoms, they said some of these churches they're representing in Southern Ontario, there might be Mennonite churches there. They don't usually use a lot of the online services. They don't use that kind of technology, so they need people to come in and worship in person. Now, Brian, vaccines have arrived in Canada, but they're going out quite slowly. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has said that he's frustrated that vaccines are sitting in freezers and not in our arms. What's the holdup?
I have to say that I agree with him on this, and I've been very critical, and we've talked about it, about the federal government not getting the provinces enough vaccines quickly enough. We're still, even with the numbers that we have, not where we should be. But now the provinces do have a limited number of vaccines, and they're having trouble getting them from freezer to arm. That's problematic. I can tell you that the pace has picked up since the first vaccines were delivered the week of December 13, 14. That's a good thing. We're looking at a lot of provinces being between 30 and 40% of their available supply being used. But guess what? They're all getting new doses later this week, early next week. So they've got to start using them. We need to be doing a lot more vaccinations than we are now. To give you an example, we're at about 7,500 to 8,000 per day in Ontario now. That's a big increase from where we were. But we need to be able to do 150,000 a day by the time we start getting vaccine supply in serious numbers. That is a big jump. If you can't handle getting 50,000 doses, how are you going to handle getting millions of doses? The provinces need to get their act together. And since many of them took shots at the Prime Minister, it's only understandable that he would take a shot back in terms of his comments about freezers and arms.
Political reporter and one of our regular contributors, Brian Lilley, thanks again for your time today.
Thank you, Hal.